self as context, which really comes down to not being overly attached to an identity that you've created for yourself. Now, many people will hold themselves back because they have defined themselves in a way based on their past behaviors and past failures. And frankly, defining themselves this way avoids any kind of uncertainty or pressure to make any behavioral changes. But if you constantly reinforce this past you, you're going to assume every future attempt is going to be exactly the same, which ultimately only sets you up for predictable outcomes. I get it. It keeps you safe. It puts you in a position where you are in control of that outcome, but it also limits you. It limits your potential and it limits opportunities that could have come your way. Now, when applied to these very short bursts of dietary non-adherence, such as like moments when you stray from your plan, you might be tempted to label yourself and be like, yep, like I always mess up on my diet, or I can't really be adherent. Like after 5 days, I just eat the whole kitchen. There's no way that I'm going to be able to go 2 weeks without falling off plan. Like all of these like labels and the ways that you talk about yourself negatively, you're just further embedding and giving power to this identity of yourself as someone who's not successful. Now, identifying closely with these thoughts, you reinforce that negative self-image that ultimately is going to hinder progress. Instead, I would embrace it like this. You can acknowledge that like, hey, I fucked up. Like, yeah, I did not track. I was overindulgent. And really the vernacular around this, I think, is so important, which we already talked about, is like, instead of calling it like, I eat like a fat ass, or I overeat all the time, or I always go off track. Like the way that you talk about yourself is ultimately going to affect how you view yourself. So calling it what it is, like, yes, highly palatable food is very tasty and it's very easy to overeat it because of what is happening chemically in our brains when we do consume that kind of food. Now, the same line of logic applies to the phase that you're in describing your body image. Are you describing being, 15, 20 pounds above stage weight as obese? Are you telling yourself that you've really fallen off track because you haven't really been able to string several weeks together on a plan? You can acknowledge that, hey, right now you might not absolutely love your physique the same way that you love your leanest physique or a physique where you do feel very confident. But this current body image, this current behavior, it doesn't have to define you. And I think this is where it's really important to observe that thought and instead go like, yeah, like I'm feeling a little disappointed. I'm feeling discouraged because I did deviate from my diet and I know I have the discipline to be more adherent. I think it's very unrealistic to expect perfection at all times from everyone. And I think this is just another way that we can consider it self-sabotage. We can consider it a cop-out, but taking this perspective instead, I think this is going to allow you to recognize that everyone experiences setbacks and a single event does not have to dictate or determine your entire identity. By not anchoring your identity to these slip-ups or even like potential phases where you're not at your favorite physique, you free yourself up to make better choices moving forward. And you understand that lapses are temporary and they can be separate from who you are and the behaviors that you demonstrate, which ultimately is something in someone that is capable of growth and positive change. So one of my friends, she comes to me and she's like, I don't know how you do it. I can't stick to a diet. Like no matter what I do, day 5, day 6, like I always fall off track. And I challenged her. I'm like, okay, like let's start here. Like, do you think you could feel this way? Like you could feel like you're not someone who's good at following a diet, but instead just act like someone who does follow their diet like to the gram, like this idea in your head around someone who's like perfectly adherent. Could you just pretend to do that and act in accordance? And I challenged her. I'm like, okay, like if you could do that, if you could just do that for a day, wouldn't that be evidence enough to show yourself that like, hey, this is technically possible. The thing that has to occur is you have to not be non-adherent. You have to be adherent. And when I framed it like that, I'm like, okay, so we are just avoiding non-adherence. So when does non-adherence happen? Like, what does that look like in your day? She's like, well, that always happens at the end of the day. Typically, I'll get home, me and my husband will start making dinner, but sometimes I get a little lazy. I'll start snacking. Sometimes he'll suggest things for dinner that honestly sound really good. And rather than be like, no, like I need to stay on track, I'll just indulge. I'll give in. I'll be like, yeah, let's order the pizza. Let's have some wine. So I was like, okay, well, if you're on track all throughout the day while you're at work and it really just seems to be an issue at night. What if you told your husband, like, hey, I want to stay on track tonight. If you want to have pizza, wine, that's totally okay. But I'm going to get this other meal instead. I'm going to either make something or order something that I know is a part of my plan. What if you did that instead? And she thought about it. She was like, well, yeah, like that doesn't feel good to have to tell him that in advance because frankly, I enjoy the pizza, I enjoy the wine, I enjoy kicking back. And I'm like, I know, like it makes sense why you would. Those are enjoyable things. Those are very indulgent things that feel good to decompress and relax. But what if you get ahead of it? What if you avoid having to have that hard conversation when, let's say, you don't really have the bandwidth, you don't have the mental faculty to put your foot down and be like, yeah, like I really want to be on plan tonight. That would make me really happy. What if you had that conversation instead earlier in the day or even the night before? The thing is that like what most people fail at and where most people fail is often the internal struggles that they manage and the decision making that accompanies with making these decisions preemptively. So when am I going to have this conversation? When am I going to commit to staying on track? Typically people learn these behaviors and they continue to act the same way again and again because it keeps them safe. But instead, I think if you can challenge yourself to no longer let yourself identify as someone who just can't lose weight or someone who always overeats, I think this kind of self-labeling, it keeps you stuck and it also puts you in a position where why would you learn new behaviors? You don't have to be defined by your past failures. And I think beginning to see yourself as someone who can stick to a plan or overcome these challenges, I think that's the first step. I think putting yourself in an environment where you yourself want to be that person is going to start with believing that you can be that person. So instead of thinking like, okay, I've always failed at diets, reframe it as, yeah, I haven't found a diet that is sustainable, but I'm sure there's one out there. I'm sure there's a diet out there that I can stick to, that I can be 100% adherent with.